Exchanges are born out of conflict, out of need, out of persecution, out of discord, out of trouble of all kinds, and very importantly, out of the resolve of tough-minded men and women of goodwill to do something about that, to take some step, some measure, however modest, however incremental, but nonetheless that is in the direction of preventing conflict, reducing misunderstanding and hatred, addressing needs in the world, somehow working towards that higher goal. So let's go back over 100 years. Let's go back to World War I. One of our key partners right now in high school exchange, one of our most marvelous programs, is the American Field Service, AFS. Many of you may have worked with them now, you may have worked for them, you may remember them from your high school days, foreign exchange students in either direction. Well, the American Field Service began in 1915. They're over a century old, and they have their unique name because they were composed of American volunteers in France who drove ambulances and served at field hospitals to help the wounded, the injured, the sick during World War I. And they were so appalled by the carnage of World War I that they resolved that they, again, as I said, they had to come together and attempt to do something to mitigate the chances of that kind of conflict again. And the model they came up with was high school exchange, on the premise that you were all very familiar with, that if you bring young people together under the right respectful circumstances at a proper age, that chances are they will understand each other more, and they will suspect and mistrust and even hate each other, and hopefully not fight each other in the future. And that has been an enduring model. As I said, they're over 100 years old now. But World War I didn't just give us AFS, it also gave us our single largest exchange partner today, IIE, the Institute of International Education. They were formally organized in 1919, and two of the founders, there were a number of founders, but two of them were quite remarkable men. Nicholas Murray Butler, who was the president at various times of Columbia University and the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Elihu Root, who was both Secretary of War, back before it was Defense, and Secretary of State, and both individuals recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize. And so you start to look at the longevity of these programs, of these models that ECA and the State Department carry out. They extend well before the formal government process. If we skip up to World War II, of course, we all know that human nature doesn't change easily or quickly or smoothly. And of course, AFS continues to do its work because the people who conduct these programs, like all of us in this room, are optimists in the long run, even though we know we're not going to put an end overnight to any kind of the ills that beset human beings. But World War II gave us two of our iconic or flagship programs, as we like to call them. First of all, in the late 1930s, the United States government began taking notice and being concerned about growing fascist influence in Latin America. And so the State Department began working on a program in cooperation with a new position called the Coordinator for Inter-American Affairs. This was the position created by President Franklin Roosevelt. In it, he put the young Nelson Rockefeller. Some of you may know he was Vice President of the United States, Governor of New York, but early on, he was the Coordinator for Inter-American Affairs. And what they began to do was bring what we would call thought leaders, if you will, from Latin America to the United States to show them our way of thinking, our way of life, our values. That, of course, was the beginning of the International Visitor Leadership Program, which next year will celebrate its 80th anniversary. When I talk about the longevity and in that sense, the solidity and the value of international visitors, coming up on their 80th year, very, very impressive. When we brag about the fact that more than 580 of our participants from ECA have gone on to become the head of state or head of government of their own country, we're talking about IVLP. There's a handful that are not, that are from other programs, but overwhelmingly, it's the International Visitor Program. In the same way, when we say we have more than 80 Nobel laureates, we're talking Fulbright primarily, so everybody has their realm. So we began with the IVLP program, and then by the conclusion of the war, a senator from Arkansas, J. William Fulbright, was, like those ambulance drivers in World War I, contemplating the colossal global devastation of World War II, particularly the American use of nuclear weapons against Japan at the conclusion of the war, and once again asking that question, what is it that we can do? Is there anything we can do to work towards stopping and preventing this kind of violence again? And at that point, an otherwise innocuous and unremarkable bill about surplus war material came across his desk. He slipped some language into it, went artfully. When President Truman signed the bill, that was the creation of the Fulbright program. There was an Oxford Don, I think he was the master of Pembroke College, who some years back described the Fulbright program as responsible for the most significant movement of scholars across the earth since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Only an Oxford Don could get away with saying something like that. But it shows you what the tremendous cumulative impact of that decision was. And so out of World War II, our two most iconic programs, if you will. But World War II kept, unfortunately, giving as well, because President Eisenhower, President Dwight David Eisenhower, elected in 1952, was the next most seminal figure in the history of public diplomacy and exchanges. He is famous for saying, just as war begins in the minds of men, so does peace. And he was determined to put together, to establish institutions which would help put the idea of peace into people's minds. Now, given my premise about conflict and response by exchanges, it's no surprise that President Eisenhower was, of course, General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers Europe, the architect of the D-Day invasion, someone who had personally toured the Nazi death camps and was personally, again, horrified by what he had seen and determined to do something about it in the long run. So the first thing he did was he took the crazy quilt, if you will, of institutions and programs and so forth and organizations that conducted different kinds of public diplomacy and exchange programs. Some were State Department, some were defense and military, some were part of our occupying powers in Europe, and he put them together in the United States Information Agency in 1953, with one very, very, very important exception: not exchanges. Okay? It was the very firm belief of Senator Fulbright, and he persuaded President Eisenhower and others of this, that even though Washington was filled with strange bedfellows, that putting exchanges together with what they freely called propaganda at that point was too strange and would not be a good fit. It would jeopardize the value, the independence of exchanges, educational programs, if you combine them with what we now call, of course, information messaging. And so USIA began in 1953. Exchanges remained at the State Department with lots of different nuances that really don't matter at this point. But President Eisenhower wasn't done. In 1956, he pulled together a White House program called the White House Program on the White House Conference on the People-to-People Program. And it was a remarkable assemblage, about 150 people from all walks of life. Of course, they had the State Department there and the White House. The president addressed the conference, of course. They had the Department of Defense. They had the CIA there, back its predecessor. University presidents, corporation executives. They had the president of CBS, Frank Stanton. They had the cultural world. Eugene Ormandy, who was then the director of the Philadelphia Philharmonic, was there. The boxing commissioner of New York, the commander of the American Legion, the president of the Cartoonists Union. I mean, they had everybody they could think of from all walks of society. My favorite being listed on the official, I've looked at the official invitation list for this conference. It simply says, William Faulkner, author, Oxford, Mississippi. So it was an amazing crew that he developed. And I'm going to make sure I get this correct. That's why I have my little sheet here. When he addressed the conference, he said that they were engaged in, quote, the most worthwhile purpose there is in the world today, to help build the road to an enduring peace. And I don't think anybody here or today would disagree that that's still what we're all up to, trying to build that road to an enduring peace. And in fact, many of our best partners in the exchanges community take their origin from that conference. Sister Cities International, for example, dates its beginning to that 1956 conference. So does People to People International. So does the Business Council for International Understanding. So it was not just a conference at a high level where fine things were said, but actual real institutions that have gone on and had an impact over decades and generations started with that conference. And what President Eisenhower asked the members, the assemblage, will sound very familiar to you as you go about your daily business. He said, how do we dispel ignorance? How do we strengthen friendships? How do we learn about others? All good questions we ask today. Unfortunately, World War II segued seamlessly into the Cold War. There was no respite. The Cold War over the decades gave us a tremendous expansion in the number and variety of public diplomacy and exchange programs. Programs moved into radio, television, book publishing, foreign language periodicals, exhibits, cultural centers and libraries, and of course, the arts. Nothing captured the imagination quite like the arts, as the arts have the capacity to do in any aspect of life. We sent the entire Broadway cast of the Gershwin opera Porgy and Bess to Moscow and Leningrad. This is a remarkable undertaking, and we have a very good window on it because New Yorker magazine had the foresight to assign one of their most junior, but it turns out one of their most talented writers to accompany the cast, a young man named Truman Capote. And he wrote a tiny, splendid little volume called The Muses Are Heard, because he borrowed the title from a speech made by the Russian Minister of Culture, who said, when the cannons are sounding, the muses are silent. But when the cannons fall silent, the muses are heard. So again, arts and culture. And it's true to this day, by the way, for those working on Russia, there is nothing you cannot do in and with Russia if you lead with the arts. I don't know if any of you know about the phenomenon for a number of decades in the United States for ice shows and ice skating extravaganzas. Okay, ask your parents if you don't. But Holiday on Ice, the Ice-capades, I guess more recently there was Disney on Ice. I guess they still do these things. Well, it was back in 1960, the US government actually built in downtown Amman, Jordan, in the old Roman city of amphitheater area of Philadelphia, an entire outdoor ice skating rink so we could put on Holiday on Ice for the Jordanians. Of all the arts, nothing quite captured the imagination like the jazz ambassadors. Now, some of the names are not household names anymore, unless you're a jazz fan, of course, but these were all household names at the time. Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Dave Brubeck, Benny Goodman, Woody Herman. Woody Herman not quite so well known as the others, Woody Herman and the Thundering Herd, but I'm mentioning him for a reason you'll know in just a second. And they traveled all around the world. If you wanted to take a deep dive into this, which I'm not going to do right now, there's a marvelous book called Satchmo Blows Up the World, which talks all about this as a cultural and a political and a social phenomenon. Dave Brubeck and his wife Iola and Louis Armstrong went back home and wrote a jazz musical called The Real Ambassadors, meaning, of course, cultural ambassadors, not chiefs of mission. And one of the verses is, I'm not going to sing it, no commodity is quite so strange as this commodity called cultural exchange. Say that our prestige needs a tonic, export the Philharmonic. And when our neighbors call us vermin, send them Woody Herman. Okay, so, and then finally, 1961, moving right along, we get to the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. The Mutual Educational and Cultural Exchange Act of 1961. When you see it now, it always says paren as amended, close paren. But that's the Fulbright-Hays Act. What we call Fulbright-Hays is the Mutual Educational and Cultural Exchange Act of 1961. And in it, it says, quote, there is established a Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. It's worth noting that not every part of the State Department has enabling legislation. It's important to note for a lot of reasons in terms of how the Bureau operates, how it's funded, the leeway it has to create programs, the authority it has to conduct certain activities, that in fact it was created by law by Congress. I'm going to, again, I apologize for reading a couple of things, but this is who we are, because the legislation not only tells us what we do, it tells us why we do it and how we do it. So first of all, I think most of you have heard this, the purpose of this act is to enable the government of the United States to increase mutual understanding between the people of the United States and the people of other countries by means of educational and cultural exchange. But very importantly, it says, the president shall, now that's the strongest language that Congress uses, shall. The president shall ensure that all programs under the authority of the Bureau shall maintain their non-political character and shall be balanced and representative of the diversity of American political, social, and cultural life. It also states, the president shall ensure that academic and cultural programs under the Bureau shall maintain their scholarly integrity and shall meet the highest standards of academic excellence or artistic achievement. I think those are extraordinarily important words for the way the Bureau continues to this day and on into the future to conduct its business. That's the foundation on which we're built. One of the things we had during the Cold War was that the United States Information Agency sent traveling US government exhibits about life in the United States to the former Soviet Union. And they would travel from city to city, being open for a month in every city. And the topics would always be something completely innocuous. The exhibit I went on in 1975 was the American home, but they had recreation, photography, education, and so forth. Obviously, the Soviet government would never allow an exhibit on religion in America or liberty or something like that, so they had an innocuous topic. But the key thing was they were not just objects. They were staffed by Russian-speaking young Americans, and the purpose of the exhibit was not to show Russians what refrigerators and stoves look like in America, but to let Russians, Soviets I should say, because of course these went to all the republics of the Soviet Union, to let them talk to these Americans in their native language and ask anything they wanted to about the United States. They were formidably popular undertakings. Visitors would line up for 8-10 hours in advance to enter. In other words, they would come at midnight to come in at 10 a.m. In the winter, in the dark. They often had to go through police vehicles, militia cars as they call them, who were brought almost bumper to bumper, so every visitor had to walk through single file while being glared at by the militia. And people would be yanked out of line. Why aren't you at home? Why aren't you at work? Why aren't you in school? You know, rather than coming and being corrupted by these Americans inside there. But that didn't deter the audiences. The victory, if you will, in the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, brought an unprecedented time of troubles for exchanges and public diplomacy. It has often been said that the most perilous moment for any organization or any movement is the moment of victory, because then you lose the common enemy. You lose the common challenge that galvanizes everyone, that brings together the small unit cohesion, if you will. And that was absolutely true in this case. There was, perfectly understandably, because we had won the Cold War, a hue and cry for what was called the peace dividend, led primarily by the late Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he made the argument, again, entirely plausible on the surface of it, that because the United States had bulked up all around the world in every imaginable way for decades to defeat world communism, and had done so, surely there was something we could stop doing, some benefit for the American taxpayer who had borne the burden of the Cold War. We closed down virtually all our freestanding cultural centers and libraries. The ones that remained, like in New Delhi, for example, in Mexico City, or like mesas in the desert. We stopped doing exhibits entirely and closed the exhibit service. We stopped doing almost all arts programming. We stopped doing almost all sports programming. We did away with publications. We used to have a monthly publication in Russian and one in Arabic. We closed those down. We ran a reduction in force of the civil service, which is a terrible thing to go through. It was this sort of march to, where every year the budget was smaller than the year before. And then one more, come up to a little bit closer to the present, in this premise of mine about conflict and violence and discord and response by the exchange professionals, 9/11. I remember distinctly sitting in the office of former Assistant Secretary Patricia Harrison in early 2002, and she was asking the question, what do we do? Everybody was asking that question, different parts of the US government, parts of American society, academia. What do we do? How do we respond? And it had to be something significant. It had to be something meaningful. It had to be something lasting. And we had the experience of having developed, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Future Leaders Exchange Program, our one-year high school exchange program with the former Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact countries. And so we knew it was a good model. We knew it was a successful model. We knew how it worked. And I suggested we should create a flex-style program for the Arab and Muslim world. And 16 years later, the now Kennedy Lugar Youth Exchange and Study Program has had over 12,000 participants. And I hasten to say, I had nothing to do with the actual work of creating it. That was done by superbly talented people then and now in the Youth Programs Division who put it all together in brilliant fashion. But again, it is a more contemporary reminder of how a great deal of what we do is not just good and valuable in and of itself, regardless of when or how it was created, but it actually was brought forth. It actually was created by people in response to some problem, some trouble in the world. And what do I conclude from all of this? First of all, exchanges are a natural expression of the American character. Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence that we owe a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. That's as elegant a definition of public diplomacy as I ever hope to come across. It means that what we do with exchanges is we show. We don't tell, we don't preach, we don't dictate, we show. We bring people here. They see with their own eyes, they hear with their own ears, they ask their own questions, they come to their own conclusions. Because they come to their own conclusions independently and freely, those conclusions are enduring. And we understand also, one reason we show rather than tell is because we have reason to be humble. Exchanges are an expression of the American character because we're extraordinarily proud of the story we have to tell, which is the world's longest running experiment with how free men and women try to organize and govern themselves. But we know at the same time how far we fall short of the mark of our ideals. So we have things to learn, not just things to tell. That's why it's mutual understanding. And we understand we live in a glass house, that we are transparent. The world can see all of our ills as well as all of our accomplishments and all of our values. And that's why the mutuality and the mutual respect is such a key part of what we do. But it also means that we, all of us and your colleagues, we are not hothouse flowers. We are not delicate, frail creatures, okay? These institutions AFS, over 100 years. IIE, 100 years. IVLP, 79 years. Fulbright, coming up on its 75th, 76th year. These are enduring institutions because they respond to a genuine need and a genuine part of the American character. And those tough-minded men and women of goodwill that I mentioned at the very outset, that's all of you and all your colleagues. So I thank you for all of that.